Well, good afternoon. I'm Sharyl Cross, Director of the Kozmetsky Center at St. Edward's University in Austin, and I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon to chair the final panel session of the conference exploring the broader geopolitical circumstances of Eurasia related to religion and religious identity in Ukraine. The Kozmetsky Center has partnered with the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy, and with Professor Elizabeth Pardramu and her colleagues and students to sponsor a series of forums, seminars, and outreach engagement in Southeast Europe and Eurasia over the past several years. And I'd like to commend the Student Club on Religion and Law and Diplomacy at the Fletcher School and the faculty involved in organizing the session today, focusing on taking a deeper investigation into the complex array of factors relevant to understanding developments in Ukraine and the wider Eurasian geopolitical environment. And of course, religious identity is certainly important, not only in Ukraine, but also among Ukraine's neighbors in Europe and Eurasia. The lack of attention traditionally devoted to the religious factor in international relations and the tendency of the policy community to either want to avoid dealing with religion or overlooking the importance of religious identity and influence in contributing to shaping politics and geopolitical outcomes prompted me to develop a seminar on religion and security when I was serving on the faculty of the Marshall Center for American and international foreign policy professionals, military officers, diplomats, and academics. And I can say that the consensus among the seasoned professionals that participated in those sessions was that we do in fact need greater emphasis on religious literacy and knowledge in diplomatic and professional military education and for scholars of international relations in order to better understand circumstances that can impact and influence policy initiatives and outcomes. So for students of Fletcher preparing for professional careers in international relations and foreign policy, you should certainly be well served by your involvement and work in this area, including research, international and regionally focused conference initiatives, such as the gathering that you've organized today. We have an exceptional group of speakers for this final panel today focused on geopolitical and geostrategic dimensions. I think it's perfect for this panel to follow the ambassador's keynote. He raised so many of the issues that I think are absolutely relevant when we think about the future of the region. And so hopefully the presentations and the Q&A will allow for further exploration of those issues. This panel brings a diversity of professional experiences from both the academic and the policy worlds, combining US, European, and Russian perspectives. Our first speaker, Dr. Nikolas Gvosdev, Professor of National Security at the US Naval War College, editor of the longstanding policy-relevant international relations journal Orbis, and frequent contributor to the national interest, brings extensive academic and regional expertise to analysis of critical contemporary security issues for the U.S. defense community. Our second speaker, Barbora Maronkova, a career NATO professional, just completed her assignment as director of the NATO Information and Documentation Center in Ukraine. Prior to serving in Kiev, Barbara worked throughout the Western Balkans in public diplomacy and supporting the aspirations of nations of the region seeking membership in the alliance and implementing necessary reforms and public awareness efforts. On the academic track, Barbara has also published on topics of public diplomacy and communication and was recently a research fellow at the University of Southern California Center on Public Diplomacy. Barbara brings the experience of working on alliance initiatives in Ukraine and can offer better understanding of NATO thinking on the importance of religion, religious identity, informing public diplomacy and engagement initiatives in Ukraine, and more broadly throughout Eurasia, even extending into Southeastern Europe. Dr. Monica Toft, Professor of International Politics and Director for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School, has focused research on the intersection of religion and security. Her work on ethnic and religious violence, nationalism, and civil wars has been invaluable for both the academic and policy communities, helping to advance awareness and appreciation of the importance of the religious factor in global politics and conflict. And finally, Dr. Igor Zevelev is currently at the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Zevelev brings the perspective of the Russian academic foreign policy community combined with extensive experience working in leading Western defense and academic centers, including serving for several years on the faculty of the Marshall Center in Germany, teaching at the School of Advanced International Studies at SAIS, University of Washington, UC Berkeley, and holding research affiliations at the Center for Security and International Studies, U.S. Institute of Peace, and other major academic and think tank centers. Dr. Zevelev's research focuses on national identity, foreign policy, and Russian-American relations. And even though we've reached the late hour on a Friday afternoon after a full day of excellent discussions on this topic, we certainly encourage participants to remain engaged here and invite you to submit your questions throughout the panel session in the Q&A, and we will certainly do our best to address those questions before the time constraints force us to close the session. So with that, let me turn the virtual space over to our first speaker, Professor Nikolas Gvosdev of the U.S. Naval War College.
Thank you, Dr. Cross. It's a real pleasure to be here. Quickly, I'd like to issue two quick disclaimers. The first is since I do have my hat as a professor at the Naval War College, my comments don't reflect any U.S. government official position and certainly no position of the U.S. Navy. The second is in talking about these developments throughout the Orthodox world, I'm going to refer to different jurisdictions and groups by their own titles and by their own self-identification. Sometimes when we have these discussions, people like to introduce words like schismatic or non-canonical or things of that sort. And I'm not going to get into that. I'm just simply going to take everyone at face value for the claims that they make. And then finally, since we're talking about Eurasia, I do want to at least claim or stake out the geography that I am talking about. We often use Eurasia as code for former Soviet Union, but in my comments, I would expand the definition of Eurasia beyond the territory of the former Soviet Union to also encompass parts of Central and Southeastern Europe, into the Northern Middle East as well, particularly into the heartlands of what was known as the Byzantine Commonwealth, or what is usually seen as the heartland of the Orthodox world, because I think that increasingly the dividing line in these matters between former Soviet and not former Soviet is becoming less important. I have kind of 5 opening observations that I'll make and throw out for our discussion. And the first is to situate this question of what has been happening in ecclesiastical matters in Ukraine into essentially what has been a 2-century process that we've been seeing in the Orthodox world. The tension between large territorial jurisdictions and patriarchates that usually were coterminous with large multinational empires, and as those empires receded or shrank and as nation states emerged, the tension between should a patriarchate stay defined by a geographic area, or should you see new churches emerge which are coterminous with nation states? And more importantly, should new churches emerge which are specifically oriented or geared towards particular expressions of orthodoxy given the particular nation at hand or the particular ethnic group. This was something that was occurring as the Ottoman Empire was breaking up. And this idea of tension between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ecumenical Patriarchate is long-standing. When the Bulgarian Church set up its separate exarchate, when the Arab clergy of the Patriarchate of Antioch retook control of the Patriarchate in the 1890s, the Bulgarian exarchate set up in the 1870s, the Russian Church and the Russian state both supported those moves, much to the chagrin and opposition of the Ecumenical Patriarchate at the time. Beginning in the 1920s, as we had a partial breakdown of the Russian Empire, and at least certain parts of the Russian Empire escaped from being reincorporated into the Soviet Union. The Ecumenical Patriarchate helped to birth new autonomous and autocephalous churches on what had been the territory of the Russian Orthodox Church, Finland, Estonia, Poland being the most critical examples. These were steps that the Moscow Patriarchate opposed. And then the Ecumenical Patriarchate played an important role in helping particularly diaspora populations that escaped from what was to become the Soviet bloc after World War II to have jurisdictions that would not be dependent on Moscow or on church authorities that were based in Soviet bloc countries, including jurisdictions for Russians, Ukrainians, Albanians, and others. That introduced a certain degree of the Cold War into church relations between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So that's the first observation, is that Ukraine is just simply the latest iteration of this ferment in the Orthodox world over disintegration, aggregation, creation of national churches versus the preservation of larger patriarchal jurisdictions. And it won't be the last. The second, though, point is that there has been a change in global orthodoxy over the last 30 to 40 years. And partly this is a result of globalization. It's a result of diasporas beginning to settle down. It's a result of new communities coming into orthodoxy. The traditional view of the Orthodox Church is that it's a federation of national churches and territorially defined patriarchates. And we often heard this idea of canonical area. Increasingly, opportunities exist for different Orthodox patriarchates to reconceive of themselves in global terms and to aggregate to themselves a global jurisdiction. And they do this by talking not just simply about serving a specific national community or ethnic community, but that they're serving a community of tradition. The Patriarchate of Antioch spearheaded this when it began to de-emphasize, particularly in the West, the idea of Syrian identity in place of an Antiochian identity, to which you didn't have to be Arab, you didn't have to come from the Middle East, you could affiliate to this Antiochian tradition. The Ecumenical Patriarchate, particularly as its territorial base has continued to shrink over the last 60 years, from having several 100,000 people living in Turkey to under 3,000 now, as part of its survival, has embraced this idea of a global jurisdiction, of taking different autonomous churches and reaching out and having different communities globally defined under its omophorion. And finally, the third entrant to this has been the Moscow Patriarchate. The Moscow Patriarchate increasingly defines itself not simply as a church of ethnic Russians, not simply as a church of all the nationalities who live on the territory of the Russian Federation, who happen to be Orthodox, not simply as a church of people who live on the territory of the former Soviet Union, with the exception of Georgia, which has a separate autocephalous church, but the idea that there is something called a Russian Orthodox tradition to which Orthodox believers around the world can affiliate to or are partakers of, and therefore who should fall under the Moscow Patriarchate. So the Moscow Patriarchate in the last 20 years has really stepped up its efforts to ensure that it has a presence pretty much on every continent, every country. Sometimes this is done in cooperation with the Russian government in terms of having communities that meet or are connected to Russian embassies or Russian consulates, but also this idea of kind of a global Russian orthodoxy and the idea that the Moscow Patriarchate should play this global role and in opposition to the Ecumenical Patriarch. The third point is, where does this fit into the geopolitics of the Russian state? This has to do, of course, with the Russian government's conception of itself as a great power. And the Russian government's definition of a great power is a country which is an agenda setter in world affairs, that it has some degree of a zone of privileged interests or in a particular part of the world that we might term a sphere of influence. And Russia increasingly has tried to carve out or to say the space where the Euro-Atlantic world ends in the West to where the Sino-centric East Asian world begins in the East. Everything that lies between more or less falls into this civilizational Russian/Eurasian, Russian world, Eurasian space, sometimes linked to a definition of orthodoxy as well, and that is kind of Russia's patch of ground as a great power that it should have a degree of privileged interest. So holding the line on the expansion of the Euro-Atlantic community as a geopolitical imperative can also intersect with a desire to conceive of the boundaries of the Orthodox world in a way that is in opposition to the Euro-Atlantic world, which of course is not the position taken by certainly the Ecumenical Patriarchate or certainly the churches of Romania or Bulgaria and the Church of Poland as well, which see themselves very much as part of the Euro-Atlantic community. But there's that overlap there. And for the Russian state to see this vision of Russian Orthodoxy, global Russian Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodox tradition as a potential source of soft power for the Russian state. The fourth point, and kind of building on that, is that the contemporary Moscow Patriarchate does not see itself as the Orthodox Church of the Russian Federation. It does not accept the idea that because the political boundaries of the post-Soviet space have changed, that the Soviet Union was an integrated, in theory, federal republic, but a single country, and that now that has changed, the older Orthodox model is, as political boundaries change, you expect to see changes in ecclesiastical boundaries. The Moscow Patriarchate reconceives of itself as a transnational religious organization. So the fact that there are separate governments and states, Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, is again everywhere except for Georgia, which has its own canonical territory. The Moscow Patriarchate does not see a reason to give up any of its claims, nor does it see that it should therefore have to help midwife the birth of new autocephalous churches. To the extent that it can prevent those churches from emerging, it will try to do so, and if it cannot, it will then accept grudgingly the situation that we've seen certainly for the last 2 decades in Estonia, where Estonia now has 2 Orthodox jurisdictions. One is the Estonian Apostolic Orthodox Church under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The other is the Estonian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And what the Estonian situation has shown is that more or less you can establish a degree of equilibrium. There was a lot of talk in the late 90s that sooner or later all the Orthodox of Estonia would find themselves under the Estonian Apostolic Church. That has not happened. But the idea that all Orthodox Estonians sooner or later would come back under the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate, that has not happened. And so Estonia may give us some clues for how the church situation in Ukraine may stabilize over time, that it doesn't necessarily mean that one jurisdiction prevails over the other, but in fact you may end up with multiple jurisdictions, which is a situation that Orthodoxy, certainly in the United States, Canada, Western Europe, has grown very accustomed to, multiple jurisdictions in the same geographic territory. Finally, and to close out, what I think is important looking forward is since the end of 2018, the Moscow Patriarchate and the Ecumenical Patriarchate no longer are in communion with each other. The Moscow Patriarchate removed the Ecumenical Patriarchate from the diptychs, which is the list of churches that you and hierarchs that you are in communion with because of the recognition of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Subsequently, as the Church of Greece recognized the OCU, the Church of Greece was removed from the Moscow Patriarchate's diptychs. As the Church of Alexandria, the Patriarchate of Alexandria did so, the same thing happened there. Other Orthodox churches have been trying to square the circle, not condemning, but not accepting. That can work to an extent, but as we've seen in this country, it's harder when you have all the representatives of the Orthodox churches present in the same geographic area. Sooner or later, people have to make choices of who they're going to concelebrate with, who will be accepted as at the altar and who won't be. And that may be a problem over time. But what this is playing out, what I think geopolitically is more importantly, is to see that the split between Moscow and Constantinople is playing out in a number of ways. First of all, is the Russian state has made a very clear decision to tilt towards Turkey in geopolitics, trying to pry Turkey away from NATO, to work with Turkey on, in various places, Syria, Libya, now the Caucasus. What that has meant is that the interest of the Russian state in advocating for matters that might matter to the Orthodox world has diminished. It is my belief that President Erdogan of Turkey would not have moved ahead with the reconversion of Hagia Sophia back into an active mosque had the split between Moscow and Constantinople not occurred. What we saw with that is that the Moscow Patriarchate issued some pro forma protests, said this is a heritage site, we don't think this is a good idea, and immediately the Russian Foreign Ministry said this is an internal matter to Turkey of which Russia has no interest. Russia's uninterested in this. Russia's not going to make any advocation for that. And some comments that I heard partially in jest, but I think had a certain degree of seriousness, which was that if Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew has a problem with Hagia Sophia, he can call President Zelensky. Have President Zelensky raise that issue with President Erdogan, because President Putin is not going to raise it with Erdogan. Similarly, as we've seen in the Caucasus, that the extent to which the new governments in Armenia have tried to become a little more equidistant from Russia, leaning towards the West, the Russian state is sending a very clear message that shared ties of Eastern Christianity notwithstanding, if governments want to move closer to the United States and to Western Europe, that Russia will act accordingly. So definitely seeing some move there. If I were an advisor to President Erdogan, which I'm not, just to put that out there, if you wanted to continue this split at some point, because the Russian church is now out of communion with Constantinople, and this may persist for not just weeks or months, but could be for years or even decades, would be to give the Russian Orthodox Church some ecclesiastical property in Istanbul. And at the point at which the Russian Orthodox Church kind of begins to establish separate entities on the territories of patriarchates it's no longer in communion with, this has already started in the territories of Africa. The Patriarchate of Alexandria is that the Russian Orthodox Church is now saying, well, we're not in communion with Alexandria anymore, so we're now going to create standalone Russian Orthodox parishes. Over time, and I'll end on this last point so as to stay within the 10 minutes as part of this last fifth point, there's a lot of tension simmering within the Orthodox world, within Orthodox churches. My worry, or at least my analysis, is that what we might start seeing, whether it's in Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, is that as this split between Moscow and Constantinople continues, and as it acquires this pro and anti-Western tinge to it, is that different groups of Orthodox may decide to break with their own national church and then come under or seek a connection with one or the other. This is already of a concern within the Serbian Orthodox Church, given its own kind of internal dynamics, that there may be that happening there. I could see in Greece elements of the Greek old calendarists and others deciding that there's no way to reach a settlement with Constantinople, and why not reach out to a Russian Orthodox Church which is no longer in communion with the Church of Athens. And so what we might see in global Orthodoxy over time is the development of kind of two Orthodox coalitions, one that adheres more to Constantinople, one adheres more to Moscow, but which also has this geopolitical element to it of kind of pro-West, pro-American versus more pro-Russian, and therefore augmenting Moscow's soft power. So we may see a circling around where ecclesiastical issues begin to intersect and meld with geopolitical ones. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nick. You gave us a lot to unpack there, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time in the Q&A. And please, again, I encourage our participants to submit your questions in the Q&A section. Thank you so much. And let's proceed now to Barbara Maronkova, NATO.
Yes, hello, I guess good afternoon to you. It's already late evening here. Nevertheless, thank you very much. And this has been really super exciting, all the panels and the keynote speech. And I would probably follow on a lot of the messages that Ambassador Herbst had outlined. And in fact, there were a couple of things that I wanted to say to you that he already mentioned. And I took also a special note of the last points that Dr. Gvosdev made about this possible split of the Orthodox churches into West against the East. So that's very interesting too. As Dr. Cross mentioned, I just literally last week arrived after 3.5 years of serving in Kiev in Ukraine as a representative of NATO. So I'm particularly pleased to be able to address you from both the position of a NATO representative, but also perhaps offer some of my own personal observations of what was happening in Kiev over the past couple of years, especially around and after the Tomos in December 2018. Firstly, a little bit more broadly about NATO and why are we even talking about church and religion. Obviously, we are a multilateral international organization, secular one, although we have 30 member states who come from different denominations. We have member states of Roman Catholic, Protestant, different Orthodox churches, Muslim member states, etc. However, we do get interested in discussions about religion and the role of church when there is an issue related to security. Security, because that's our main business. Our role is to provide for security in the Euro-Atlantic area. Now, first and foremost, obviously, for our member states as a collective defense organization, but whatever happens on the periphery or the neighborhood of the Euro-Atlantic area, and that's exactly Middle East, North Africa, and Eurasia, is obviously of great importance to us, to our stability and the prosperity of our member states. There are, I would say, maybe 3 instances when NATO's interest with the role of churches and religion intersect. The first one is when we are operating in an environment where there is a conflict or a war. So when we are running a military operation such as Kosovo or Afghanistan, where basically our military engages with so-called leaders, including religious leaders from the different part of the conflicting parties, and try to bring together these religious communities together into some form of reconciliation processes. And this was particularly important for us in Kosovo, where our KFOR forces have been protecting, guarding the Kosovo Serbian churches on the Serbian churches on the Kosovo territory. Second instance where we get interested is when we become an object of the church's narratives. And this is often in the case when we are seeing a public discussion about NATO, a public discourse, usually around when a country is wishing to join our organization. We see an increased public discourse and interest in discussing the merits and benefits of NATO membership. And here we see the role of church also as a very important player, in some cases positive, and in some cases more of a spoiler. This has been particularly the case in Montenegro, and Dr. Cross remembers very well our discussions in Budva about the role of the Serbian church in Montenegro's discourse in relation to the country's bid to join NATO. And the third instance, which has become more novice, I would say, since 2014, and this brings me to Ukraine, is when church and religion are used as instruments in the so-called hybrid warfare. And Ambassador Herbst already alluded a little bit to this, where we have seen Russia basically using the Russian church and the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine as one of the many instruments in its toolbox in waging information warfare and propaganda against Ukraine, particularly in winter 2013 and the spring of 2014. And whilst at the beginning of the conflict, the Moscow Patriarchate was quite reluctant to get involved into this sort of propaganda blitzkrieg, as I call it. Unfortunately, we have seen in the months to come in 2014 that they became also more and more involved in many disinformation campaigns and portraying and stressing the Russian narrative about the coup d'etat which took place in Kiev, which was basically the revolution of dignity, the fascists taking over, the Banderovцы taking over, etc., etc. So this, of course, is a very unfortunate role that the church would play in any hybrid warfare, whether it's in Ukraine or any other country. However, it's of course been part of our humankind and human history, where church and religion have gone hand in hand with politics and became a political tool, which has led, unfortunately, to many wars and conflicts. So we are not seeing anything new, but perhaps something which we have not so much experienced on the European continent in the past decades. So here I would pause a little bit to maybe reflect on some of the issues which were already discussed of Ukraine receiving so-called Tomos, or receiving its own Ukrainian independent church, and how I see it. Here I will speak more on my personal observations as someone who was a diplomat in Kiev during this very exciting period. We have heard from speakers since this morning who are much more profound experts, historians, theologians about the history of how all these complicated matters came to life. But one thing that I would like to mention is to look at the issue of the independent Ukrainian church as also a political instrument in the hands of Ukrainian political elites. This has not been discussed until now. We talked a little bit about the role of, let's say, civil society, which was very interesting, but we didn't really discuss how Kiev has used this issue also to its own advantages. Now, of course, the achievement of receiving the Tomos was enormous, and even those Ukrainians who are generally not very religious have been extremely proud. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people on the streets of Kiev lining up to go to the Sofia Cathedral when the delegation from Constantinople arrived with the Tomos. The Tomos was on display in the cathedral. Well, it's not a cathedral anymore, actually, it's just it's a museum right at the moment. And there was really an amazing festive feeling in the streets of Kiev, where many of the Ukrainian people actually saw it as something which belongs to them, which creates their own identity together with their language. So as Professor Plochy said this morning, it was not so much about the religious fever of Ukrainian people, but it's more about their feeling of identity for which the church is an important pillar. So that was obviously very positive news for Ukrainian people. At the same time, we also need to understand that the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, has played a very active role, very active diplomatic role. This was also already discussed. However, we also have to acknowledge that this was also an important issue in his own presidential campaign. The presidential elections were taking place literally 4 months after Ukraine received the Tomos, and President Poroshenko has not hidden the fact that he considered himself as the one who delivered this historic opportunity to Ukrainian people, and his own presidential campaign has pretty much alluded to this and was standing on the 3 pillars of army, language, and faith. So he very much has focused on this issue, which has proven to be quite divisive still for Ukrainian society. And thus, the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine have not really bought into this campaign or into his 3 issues. They could maybe identify with the army, but the faith and the language a bit less so. Where we are a year and a half later, very, very briefly, we have President Zelensky. It was already mentioned that he's basically a secular Jew. Therefore, in his political agenda, the issue of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is really not relevant. However, he has shown a keen interest to reach out to all religious leaders of Ukraine. He has made the point to meet the religious leaders of all denominations after he was elected president, when the COVID started in March, asking the religious leaders to support the government measures and restrictions to help spread the information about the COVID measures among their followers. So this was, I believe, quite an important role that the president played, but it really was more across all the different religious communities. We also have to admit, to a relief of many of us, that the big security challenges that we were expecting to come after Ukraine received the Tomos, in terms of maybe some skirmishes, possibly some lootings or burning of churches, God forbid, or any other such instances have not happened. Here we also have to admit that the Secret Service of Ukraine had played quite a big role in leading negotiations with the parishes and the priests of all different denominations. And the situation has been fairly calm. There have been a few situations in the smaller parishes, in the rural areas, but overall the transfers were pretty peaceful. And this has really been, again, I think, a very positive story for Ukraine. So I'm going to stop here. I touched a little bit on how I see personally how the last 2 years have played in Ukrainian politics. I would suggest, as was also shown earlier this morning through the sociological polls, that majority of Ukrainian people, whilst they see themselves, or they nominate themselves as, for example, Orthodox, or that they are of some religious denomination, they are actually, majority of Ukrainian people are not that religious. And for them, the issue has been more about historical grievances, about Ukrainian independence, which is completed also with this issue, and also has to be seen in a purview of Russia's information war against Ukraine, more than anything else, I believe, from my perspective. And what we have seen with President Zelensky and current government is also that the discussion about the church has gone more from the public discourse into discourse whether civil society or very few people who are very interested in these issues, and of course the theological debates. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Barbara. Let's turn now to Dr. Monica Toft.
So thank you. So I'm going to underscore some of the points that were made by my colleagues a little bit earlier. But I first want to thank, the organizers of this conference, both Professor Barbora and the students from the RLD program. It's really terrific. And as a scholar of religion and global politics, I'm not surprised we're here just talking about religion. It's been underestimated and underexamined and therefore dismissed by a lot of international relations scholars. I'm an IR scholar, but also about policymakers as an important explanation for foreign policy and national security. So I think this conference is just terrific. I mean, the one exception has been Islamic jihadism, particularly after the horrors of 9/11, and now in the continued fight against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But what's striking is those involve non-state actors. That seems to be the norm. That's how you study religion. And actually what we're studying here is actually states and the role of religion with states. So not only in how faith and religious authorities align within a state, but then in how those states turn to religious institutions, their traditions, their identities, their leaders to advance national interests. And I think that's what we're talking about here today. And I think Russia is perhaps one of the largest nations doing that today, in part because it is a great power, but also it is a leader of the Orthodox faith, one of the largest faiths around the world. And this has really taken off since the 1990s, and obviously it has important implications for Ukraine, but other states around the region. So Ukraine is basically, a buffer state between the West and Russia, and it's not a happy situation from them. Russia's demonstrated that it's willing to use both hard power, right, military force, and now soft power. It's always been very good at soft power to control what it believes is its spheres of influence. And it relies on soft power more so elsewhere and with different kinds of actors. You can think about the United States, UK, Britain, and France, where soft power comes into play a bit more. And for soft power, with respect to religion, it sees itself as the vanguard of the Orthodox faith. And it has for at least the last 20 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and particularly with the rise of Putin. And if we understand soft power to be the shaping of preferences through attraction and appeal, and here I'm using Joe Nye's definition, as opposed to coercion and force, then the Orthodox Church is a handy tool of statecraft. And this has been happening systematically for the last 20 years. So the National Security Council of the Russian Federation produced a new national security concept, which was signed by former President Boris Yeltsin, but he stepped aside 2 weeks later to allow President Putin to sort of put it into play. So with the failure of communism, the government needed a new set of ideas to help guide state policy. Communism was defunct for a decade. And what renewed under Putin was the spiritual renewal of Russia, and that the Russia state, there was an external piece to this, should encourage the spiritual and moral development of society, and not just society, but also Orthodox communities. So it's not surprising that this partnership has emerged, given that both the church and the state seem to value and adhere to strong notions of order, hierarchy, and authority. And so in my book, God's Century, that I co-authored with Dan Philpott and Timothy Shah, what's happened is the church has moved from an independent relationship with the state in the 1990s to now have a more integrated one. It's consensual, right? It's not conflictual, but it's more integrated. And it's actually going to limit the maneuvers of both of them, but the church I would regard even more so. So after years of communism and atheism, the Russian Orthodox Church has regained a central place in Russian identity and has become a critical piece of its nationalism and its foreign policy. So I'm going to be paraphrasing a really terrific article that I think people should read from the National Interest, written by Marcel van Herpen in 1999, and add to it a bit, and talking about the ways in which the church, but particularly Russia, has benefited. So first, we all know that most Russians do not practice their faith, but they do see it as integral to their culture and society. And Dr. Maronkova has already alluded to that. Right? It's a really critical piece of their identity. So a good relationship with the church makes people feel better about the state. So it's a nice synthetic relationship there. Second, it allowed the regime, the government, to draw on pre-existing ideas. Some of the heavy, work was done because they could draw on symbols and rituals fairly quickly without having to resort to the invention of a new state ideology. It was already there. Third, this alliance has allowed the state to piggyback on the church's support of traditional values against what is perceived to be decadent Western values. And we can talk about gay rights, we can talk about sexual preferences, a whole, abortion. And Putin, his administration, has really put up this idea of traditional family values as critical to the state, therefore helping to sharpen an ideological struggle with the West. Fourth, it's married the church with Russian nationalism. And I understand that it also has a global one, but it's very important to Russian nationalism, emphasizing that the Moscow Patriarch is considered Moscow as the third Rome, or the spiritual center for all Orthodox believers. Fifth, it's allowed for the state to push out the idea of pan-Slavism, and that all Slavs should be tied to Russia in some form, and that they share a common heritage and a common destiny, right? So this becomes a leeway in which to do that. And sixth, a significant reason for the collapse of the USSR was due to the decline of the Slavic population relative to the Muslim population. I've written on this if anybody's interested. So this partnership, considering that the church absolutely has strong ideas on reproduction and women's bodies, this partnership means that the Kremlin has an ally in promoting greater Slavic fertility. And for the Kremlin, under Putin, this has been a national security issue, given that the fertility rates are not increasing dramatically and that there's a disproportionate dying off of Slavic males in the Russian Federation. So the bottom line is that tradition and values have become a key export of President Putin and of populist parties, which are sponsored by Moscow in an effort to undermine Western liberal democracy and universal human rights. And the Orthodox Church has become a cudgel that Russia can use not only for domestic purposes, but in the region and beyond. And so here we get to, the broader issues, which is you just consider, and this is already mentioned, in 2003, Putin had contacted Metropolitan Loris, who was the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, a church founded by Russian emigres who fled, and there's about 1 million adherents to that church. And now there's been a reconciliation, and their parishes and monasteries are all around the world, which gives sort of a lever for Moscow in a number of countries, including in the United States, as well as Britain and France. So in essence, and this is already mentioned, is Russia wants to be not just a national church or a regional church, but a global one. So this is despite the fact that most Orthodox Christians in Ukraine, right, believe that the national church has the highest authority. But scarily, if you think about this and you're thinking about people having allegiances elsewhere, 17% do see authority resting with Moscow. And in Russia, the number is 69%. These are based on polls by Pew in 2019. Moreover, for Ukrainians, just like for Russians, orthodoxy is tied to identity, with 78% identifying with orthodoxy. That's a number that's doubled since 1991. And 51% saying that it's at least somewhat important for someone to be Orthodox to be truly Ukrainian. And it's about the same in Russia, with 71% identifying as Orthodox and 57% saying it's a sign of being Russian. So what does this mean for Ukraine? I think it means a lot. So the Orthodox Church, from the Ukrainian perspective, is seen as a fifth column that will be difficult to counteract Russia's, strategic and geopolitical ambitions in the region. So returning to these Pew polls, Ukraine may not have a lot of Orthodox allies to sort of push back on Russia's authority. 77% of Serbs and 62% of Georgians believe that Russia has an obligation to protect Orthodox Christians outside its borders. An obligation. Surprisingly, though, even only 17% recognize the Patriarch of Moscow as the highest authority. 41% of Orthodox Ukrainians feel that Russia has an obligation. So you've got 77% of Serbs, 62% of Georgians, and 41% of Orthodox Ukrainians who And there is a split within Ukraine. It's not just a regional issue, but even in Ukraine, in East Ukraine and West Ukraine, 55% of those living in East Ukraine say that Russia has an obligation, while only 58% in the West disagree with that. So we know about the splits in Ukraine. So Ukraine not only faces domestic challenges here in defending itself against Russian Orthodox incursions, but regional ones as well. It may not have allies to turn upon. So in conclusion, the Russian Orthodox Church's cozy relationship, it's an integrated relationship with the state, has meant that Russia has one more avenue for pursuing its interests, a soft course, but a very, very powerful course. It's worked to end pluralism in the church, as evidenced by the reconciliation and the other issues that were discussed by Dr. Gvosdev. The church seems to be willing to do some of the bidding of the state, including at the United Nations. It's been a prominent speaker there, and thereby shielding the Russian state from being called out on some of these issues. So what needs to happen is recognition, right, that not only Russia not only abides by a particular religious tradition, but that its leaders are now instrumentalizing politically to advance its interests and undermine those of others. And I would just say Ukraine is just one of these states in this endeavor. So I'll conclude there.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Toft. Let's move on to the final presentation, Dr. Igor Zevelev.
Thank you very much, Sharyl. I will talk about identity, geopolitics, and some new foreign policy tools Russia employs in its relations with Ukraine. And I hope discussing these issues would supplement our deliberations on religious dimension of Ukraine's challenges. I would like to address three questions in my presentation. I will first discuss the historic intellectual roots of Russian perceptions of Ukraine that have a strong influence on the Kremlin policy today. Second, I will examine citizenship proliferation as a powerful policy tool that the Kremlin may use when managing their relations with Ukraine in the coming years. And finally, I will assess geopolitical consequences of Russian policies. So, what is Ukraine to Russia? Ukraine is the most important country among the Soviet successor states and probably in the entire world for Russia's national security and national identity. In spite of, and probably because of this, the relationship between the two countries has been extremely difficult after the Soviet collapse. Earlier this year, in late February, President Putin once again shared his interpretation of Ukrainian history in his interview. And the key to his understanding of Russian and Ukrainian national identities is an unshakable belief, quote, that we are one and the same people, unquote. And this concept has guided Putin's Ukraine policy for 20 years. It is deeply rooted in Russian intellectual history and discourses and demonstrates the surprisingly strong impact that ideas generated in the 19th century have on the Kremlin's worldview today and its foreign policy thinking. British historian Geoffrey Hosking wrote that, quote, Britain had an empire, but Russia was an empire and perhaps still is, unquote. As a result, there have been no clear historically consistent criteria for distinguishing us from them in Russian consciousness. Political, historical, cultural, religious, ethnic boundaries, as well as subjective mental maps held by Russians are not congruent. The Russian intellectual elite of the 19th century usually lagged behind conceptual changes happening among other peoples of the empire. Non-Russians in the western parts of the countries were busily constructing collective national boundaries between themselves and Russians in the second half of the 19th century, and it went mostly unnoticed in St. Petersburg. In the minds of most Russian intellectuals of that time, the little Russians, or Ukrainians, the white Russians, Belarusians, and the great Russians, ethnic Russians, I use those terms used by them, comprised one Russian people. And this intellectual tradition has a defining impact on Soviet and post-Soviet Russian narratives. In 1991, not just the Soviet Union collapsed, but a centuries-old Russian Empire disappeared from political map. However, it has not disappeared from the mental maps of many people in Russia, and Russians had a hard time recognizing newly independent states as truly independent nations, Ukraine and Belarus in particular. And this was a deep national identity crisis in 1991, and it still lingers. And that is why there is still an essentially ambiguous set of ideas about Ukraine in the Russian national discourse. And abstract conceptions and historic images make their way to policy making in Russia with a remarkable ease. And I will demonstrate it by discussing my second point, new citizenship regime. In 2019 and 2020, Russia employed a new policy tool in its relations with Ukraine. It's a new citizenship policy. Russia opened an expedited path to Russian citizenship to millions of Ukrainians. And these changes in the citizenship law correspond with Putin's image of Ukraine. The new amendments to the citizenship law are effectively based on the belief that the Russians and Ukrainians are one people. First, geographically specific categories of individual eligibles for fast-track naturalization in Russia were introduced last year. And according to Putin's orders, this status was initially granted to residents of the unrecognized Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, but later the same year, last year, a fast-track path was granted to all those resided in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine. So 7 million people became eligible to acquire Russian citizenship easily and quickly. As a result of those moves, a special kind of Russian citizenship regime was effectively introduced on certain territories of Ukraine. Second, a new set of amendments simplified citizenship application procedures for all citizens of Ukraine, as well as Belarus, Moldova, and Kazakhstan, earlier this year in April. And the 5-year residence requirement was lifted. And in most cases now, it would take about or less than a year for a Ukrainian to become a Russian citizen. And the newest amendments to the citizenship law would also allow all individuals, not only Ukrainians, to apply for Russian citizenship without losing their existing citizenship elsewhere. And in order to get naturalized in Russia, applicants no longer have to give up on their current citizenship. And the main target audiences of the new legislation are two groups of Ukrainians, and each of them potentially includes several million people. The first one is those who plan to move to Russia permanently, and that will correspond to most recent migration policy. But the second category includes those who will remain residents of Ukraine, but will nevertheless obtain Russian citizenship. In theory, the 2020 amendments are effective after moving to Russia only, but in practice, however, lifting the requirement to abandon Ukrainian citizenship would encourage many people to have residence in both countries. And greater numbers of Ukrainians will seize the opportunity to become dual citizens and will travel back and forth between the two countries. The experience of other Central European nations like Hungary, Serbia, Croatia, and Romania is that the citizens of lower income states are eager to seek employment, education, and medical care in neighboring countries, and dual citizenship simplifies and accelerates the process. A similar group of Ukrainians will be an instrument of Russian influence over its number in all domains, including religion. And finally, what are geopolitical consequences of recent changes in Russian citizenship law? Maintaining the post-Soviet space as Moscow's exclusive zone of influence is the Kremlin's key regional goal. And Russia's capacity to engage its citizens and compatriots in the post-Soviet states located west of Russia is gradually becoming one of the key instruments of Moscow's policy in the region. Russia can claim its citizens' loyalty in the time of crisis and turbulence. And transnational citizenship regime may eventually become one of the main tools of securing Russian regional hegemony. And rapid proliferation of Russian citizenship in Ukraine and potentially in Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Moldova may challenge the viability of these countries. But I would like to wrap up on a slightly more positive role, and I will stop in 30 seconds. The blurred political map of the post-Soviet space may be viewed as a potentially positive development. Boundaries between states are becoming less significant in view of free movement of people. And many people today around the world may name more than one country as their homeland. And transnational citizenship may be more conducive to peace and security than the old system of clearly defined and well-bordered nation states. Nation states emerged in Europe from bloody wars centuries ago, and this system may be giving way to multiple loyalties and new forms of belonging. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Igor. Could I ask our panelists to return with your cameras so we create the semblance of all being here together? And let me exercise my privilege as chair to ask sort of an overarching retrospective question that I think has significant consequences for the current circumstance. And let me start by returning to Professor Alan Hendrickson's point that he made earlier in the conference, reminding us of Mikhail Gorbachev's vision of a common European home. And ask our panelists, each of you, if you think that we have, by our policies, our actions, and the lingering bifurcated mindsets carried over from the Cold War, fuel this division between the Euro-Atlantic community and the Russian world, the Ruski Mir, the sense of an empire, still retaining an empire, leaving nations like Ukraine and other states in circumstances where in many ways they feel that they have to make a choice, that it's either Russia or the West, either or, in a zero-sum competition that is now potentially even dividing the global Orthodox world, as Professor Nik Gvosdev suggested. And do you think that this was inevitable? Were these circumstances inevitable? Were they desirable? And more important, what are the long-term stakes at the strategic level if this division between Russia and the West, or Russia and the Euro-Atlantic community, or even within the Orthodox world, continues unabated? That's my first question to the entire panel, and then I want to turn to some excellent questions also raised by our audience. Nick, would you like to start? Or Monica, either of you?
If you want me to go ahead and start. Just briefly, look, the problem that we have retrospectively looking at policy over the last 25 years since the end of the Cold War was, in the end, we in the West assumed that there was only one of two outcomes that would happen. Either Russia would be fully integrated with the Euro-Atlantic community. And remember that the memo that was prepared for Secretary of State Warren Christopher in 1993 predicted Russia would be a member of NATO by 2005. Right, we're 2020, and I don't think anyone today is expecting Russian entry into NATO. And so that was one assumption, was that Russia was just going to be, and therefore all of these problems that Russia has with its neighbors would be subsumed, because that, after all, that was the promise of the European Union post-Maastricht, right? The European Union solved the Hungarian problem, which it maybe hasn't now, but we were used to talk about the Treaty of Trianon and Hungarians outside of Hungary. Well, the European Union promised to solve those problems. It promised to solve the Northern Ireland problem, because with both Britain and Ireland in the EU, it meant that Northern Ireland could be both. I mean, I think we had that optimism of the 90s that these problems would be solved. The other option we assumed was that Russia was going to disappear as a great power. It wouldn't matter, right? That Russia would collapse. The countries of the Soviet bloc would have escaped from Moscow's control, and then Moscow disappears as a great power. The problem we have had is option 3, which was Russia resurged as a great power, and it was not inclined to be as cooperative with the West. I think that's the dilemma geopolitically that we're facing, is that the two options we were counting on to kind of be where we were going to be in 2020 have not played out. Where does this play out in terms of orthodoxy and other things? The other thing is that as Brexit has shown, as what's happening in Hungary and Slovakia and Poland, in Italy, in other places have shown, is that the kind of optimism about the Euro-Atlantic world conceals that there are in significant pockets that the populists of the right and the left in Europe, and then even in the United States, have been able to tap into. And that plays into this, I think, this religious question as well, that if you're worried about globalization and homogenization, and you're going to lose your identity, and traditional values are disappearing, this has been part of the Russian soft power offensive in recent years, which is that that Russia stands for nationalism. It stands for self-identification of peoples. It's one reason why, even if Turkey is moving in a neo-Ottoman direction and isn't particularly friendly to the Orthodox within its borders, Erdogan and Putin nevertheless speak this common language of resistance to the homogenizing norms of the Euro-Atlantic world. And there are pockets, I think, throughout the Orthodox world of people who adhere to that, who say, Moscow, we need a stronger Russia, because Russia, you see this a lot in Orthodox chat rooms, in Orthodox publications, the idea that Russia is the bulwark against kind of post-secular modernism of the Euro-Atlantic world riding roughshod over everyone. And the fact that you even have figures like Pat Buchanan in the United States who essentially assert that thank God, I was, Pat Buchanan will say, I was a cold warrior, but today, thank God for Russia for, standing astride, modernism. It shows you the power of that narrative. And I think we're going to, potentially see this continue to be a force. Even if we have electoral change in the United States this year and electoral change elsewhere, I think that these populist and nationalist currents that have been unleashed in the Euro-Atlantic world aren't going to be just, shoved back into the bottle. And they are ways for Russia itself to continue to exercise some of its sharp power and soft power. So I think that that's going to be an ongoing question. And we'll see how it plays out. Again, we have some potential markers moving forward. We just had the elections in Montenegro, where it was very clear that the opposition of the Orthodox Church played a role in the defeat of Djukanovic. We have these tensions in some of the other Central and East European countries. So, we'll see. I think we have, again, Ukraine is not a sui generis case in these matters, but is one of a number of these areas where these intersections of religion, nationalism, populism, and to some extent anti-Americanism are beginning to take hold.
Absolutely, yes. Professor Monica Toft.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I would put a slightly different cast on it, because I'm not sure that the administration thought that Russia would collapse. I mean, look, it's still a nuclear armed state. It's pretty formidable. in terms of, you think about its ethnic makeup, it's actually fairly solid as a country, and it has a strong leader that has a lot of support, although his support has been diminishing lately. I mean, I think what I would say is that Dr. Cross, you asked, how have we contributed to this, right? And I think, we lost our sense of humility. So when the Soviet Union was collapsing, the administration under H.W. Bush really understood that there were people on the other side of this, and that this hurt and this was painful, and that we need to be quite respectful of what this country, this nation, these people, these citizens are going through. And then through the 1990s, somehow we lost that, and we became quite hubristic in thinking we're going to tutor these people on what it means to be democracy. And I think in some ways ushering in Putin as the strong leader, right? On top of that, going into Kosovo and not really negotiating with Russia about Kosovo in 1999. And then you had the Chechen, and basically Putin said, well, this is what you did in Kosovo. We have the right to do this in Chechnya. So I think we could have handled it a little bit differently with a little bit more humility in the 1990s so that the relationship wouldn't be so fraught. That's not to say that we're not going to have competition. Look, these are major powers. These are great powers. And, they jostle with each other in the international community for influence. And Russia, given that, its conventional arms are much weaker, its conventional military power is much weaker, it's going to look around for the tools that it can use. So it's not surprising that it's using the Orthodox Church to do that. And it's going to continue to do that in the foreseeable future, and use it as a way to sort of divide the West further and perhaps create some sort of alliance across, in addition to other kinds of alliances. So, Putin's a smart guy. He's a wily guy. He's quite strategic, and he plays his really weak hands quite well. But what I'd say is that we've contributed to that. We didn't have to push the Partnership for Peace as quickly as we did in the 1990s. NATO expansion, pushing it as quickly and right up to the border as we needed it to. And so I do think that it wasn't inevitable, to answer your question, and that we could have handled it differently. That's not to say we wouldn't still have security competition in Europe. We would, but it may not be as hostile as what we're facing today.
Barbara, Igor, please. Your microphone is still.
Being a Central European and a Slovak, I might slightly disagree with some of the points made by previous speakers. I mean, from a Central European point of view, I mean, for us, joining the EU and joining the NATO was of extreme importance, particularly in guiding our reforms. And while, we might have some problems, I'm not sure Slovakia might necessarily qualify in the same categories. For example, our southern or northern neighbor of Slovakia necessarily. I mean, I think the whole region has achieved quite a lot dramatically in 20 years, particularly when I can compare what my life looked like in the 90s and what the life looks like in 2021 in Ukraine. And I have to say there isn't much difference. So I see this very personally, and I can confirm that when I arrived to Kiev in beginning of 2017, I really felt like I'm back in Slovakia in 1998. And I would argue that the fact that we had the EU and NATO membership so close to us, and we had to work hard to get it, has really helped us to overcome a lot of the structural economical problems, but also societal problems that I see still persisting in Ukraine. Now, obviously, Ukraine is a different piece of cake, and I'm not sure I would even say it's a Cold War mentality. It's basically the Russian, great power, Westphalian order, empire type of thinking still. And it really sees Ukraine as part of its neighborhood. It's an integral part of them, which of course makes it so much more difficult for Ukrainian people or Belarusian people even today to really distinguish themselves. And that's why I think the issue of language and religion in Ukraine since 2014 especially has been so strong, and they have such strong feelings and views about this because they really feel that they really wish to show that they're Ukrainians. And this is, I think, very important for building their identity and first understanding who they are. And then once you understand who you are, you might hopefully start rebuilding your state and your society into something more successful. But these are very personal remarks as someone who comes from Central Europe. Thank you.
Yes, there's no question that I absolutely can see both sides of this. I was in Moscow in 1999. I had the privilege to be a Fulbright scholar during that year in the Russian Academy of Sciences and teaching on Russian-American relations at that very year of the Kosovo NATO air war. And so I think Professor Toft, I think she's absolutely right in what she says, having witnessed that from the vantage point of Moscow and the tremendous transformation that made in terms of thinking in Russia about the West, about the potential for partnership. It was sort of perceived as a real wake-up call where they had very high expectations that the collapse of the Soviet Union would lead to sort of an equal partnership between Russia and the West. And the combination of NATO enlargement with the air war in Kosovo really dampened those expectations. And at the same time, Barbara, I completely take your point very well, having worked in East Central Europe, Southeast Europe, Eurasia, and recognizing the critical importance that if not NATO and the EU, what would have been there in terms of providing the kind of support and community and for defense transformation, political reform in those countries. So that's sort of how we got to this point. But whether it had to be inevitable, this sharp division that we're seeing, the resurgence of conflict between Russia and the West, and thinking at the strategic level, which is what I think is really lacking long term. Where are we headed and what are the stakes here? I think that's a very serious issue that we certainly can't neglect. And so let me turn now, Igor Zevelev would like to enter the discussion. And Igor, please.
Thank you, Sharyl. Just a couple of words to add to the discussion. You may often hear and come across this claim that the so-called countries in between face dilemma. You are with the West or with Russia. Was it inevitable? From my perspective, absolutely not. Political choices are critical, and there was a series of political choices on both sides which have led to this situation we have, that it's indeed, it looks like you are with the West or with Russia. And this issue is a part of a broader, almost philosophical issue about diversity on international arena. Many Western countries claim that domestic diversity is a source of strength, not a source of weakness. It's much more difficult to acknowledge this when you think about international arena, because different countries have not only different geopolitical interests, but also different values and different nature of their political regimes. And sometimes it's very difficult to acknowledge that this is just a sign of diversity. It is often viewed as a sign of that one side on this wrong side of history. And unfortunately, in the global discourse about Russia, we're now in a situation that many people who in the 90s did believe in possibility of partnership between Russia and the West now believe that Russia is simply on the wrong side of history. And it's indeed difficult to acknowledge that poisoning opposition leader is just a sign of that you are different and world is diverse. This is a real challenge. I do not have a clear answer to that. But it was not inevitable. It was a series of political choices on both sides.
Let me invite Professor Elizabeth Padramu now to join us. She has a question.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to the panelists and to Dr. Cross for just a tremendous concluding session on today's conference. I have a relatively focused question, drawing from the previous speakers and also in particular from Professor Gvosdev's presentation today. And that goes to the Turkey-Russia, Erdogan-Putin relationship and the how that figures into the Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine when it came to the decision on autocephaly for the Orthodox Church. We heard earlier today that President Putin had appealed to President Erdogan, and we know that to be true, about to try to stop the decision of the Ecumenical Patriarchate granting autocephaly to the Ukrainian Church, and that Erdogan's refusal to do that was the result of, at the time, an uptick in Russia-Turkey tensions, largely related to the Middle East and Syria. I wonder if there's an alternative read of that, and I was thinking about this in terms of Professor Gvosdev's presentation as well, which is that both Putin and Erdogan share a similar goal when it comes to the way in which the tomos of autocephaly has affected the Ecumenical Patriarchate. First of all, both Erdogan and Putin are committed to the eradication and the elimination of that patriarchate. The Turkish state has pursued that policy for 100 years. And the Putin government, by virtue of its Ruski Mir and Third Rome agenda, also is committed to supplanting the Ecumenical Patriarchate with the Moscow Patriarchate. So Erdogan, thinking strategically, refused that request, knowing full well that the response to autocephaly would be to reinforce anti-Westernism in Russia. It would be to reinforce Russia's malign activities vis-a-vis both Ukraine, but also vis-a-vis the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And we know they've used cyber warfare against the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And at the same time, going to your point, he would then invite the Russian Orthodox Church to begin establishing churches inside Turkey, further supplanting the already vulnerable and isolated Ecumenical Patriarchate. And in that regard, the Hagia Sophia decision was in some ways a gift to Moscow for not stepping in on the Ukraine decision. Now, I realize that's some may call this conspiracy theorizing, but I think there's evidence to support the possibility of the validity of these claims. So I wondered, Professor Gvosdev, if you, how you would react to that.
No, Dr. Prodromou, I think, first of all, you're dealing with leaders in the world, in that part of the world, who understand the role of religion and separate private faith and devotion, which I think is the blind spot of most American policymakers, right? Which is, we say religion is a private matter and it has to do with morality, and we look for signs of faithfulness. Whereas in that part of the world, and in much of part of the world, people can separate private devotion and belief from the public role of religion as a marker of identity, as a marker of community, as a conveyor of history and national tradition. So in that sense, Erdogan and Putin, regardless of their private religiosity, and I know that there's evidence to suggest that both have a degree of private religiosity, or at least their own beliefs about the role of faith, that in their public roles and as geopoliticians and as strategists, they understand that institutional religion is something that you play on the chessboard. What the tomos, again, you can kind of see this as, to the extent that the Ecumenical Patriarch is presiding over the extinction of the community that's left in Istanbul, in Constantinople. There's no doubt about it. And, if I may just back up briefly, why, the hope at the beginning of the 2000s was that, when Turkey looked like it was going to be restarting membership talks for the European Union, the Ecumenical Patriarchate really thought that this was its salvation, that if Turkey got into the EU, first of all, it would be bound by more EU standards, Turkey would have to accept the decisions, which, by the way, Greece has had to accept from the European Court on regulation of religious affairs. But also, as we have seen with other things, it would get around the problem of nationality, because EU citizens could then live and work and reside in Turkey. This might lead to a return, at least, of some of the Greek community to Istanbul. It might change the dynamic. By Turkish law, the Patriarch of Constantinople must be a Turkish citizen. And as you have fewer and fewer Orthodox Turkish citizens, you have fewer and fewer candidates to become ecumenical patriarch. Well, if Turkey was in the EU, you could have potentially gotten around that. That didn't happen. There's the sense that the ecumenical patriarchate now needs to find and make sure that it has daughter churches, right? And I think that was the thinking, that Finland, Estonia, the diaspora, the mission churches in East Asia and South Asia, and in Europe as a whole. And the Tomos, I think, was this idea of also saying to the Turkish government, see, look, we still matter. You have to take us into account. But I think that the Turkish view, which I would concur with your assessment, was that this was the divide. This was a great way to divide Russia from Ukraine in ecclesiastical terms, but divide the Russian Orthodox Church from the ecumenical patriarchate. And also, it's a very small group, obviously, in Ukraine, but Patriarch Filaret has in the last year begun to voice some real concerns about the autocephaly, as saying, well, we really didn't get autocephaly, and now we're just really a dependent church of Constantinople. And in return, Metropolitan Epiphany, said, we're going to, we still respect Patriarch Filaret, but we're removing him from any active role in church governance, and he's retired, and his acts and his canonical, we no longer view him as having canonical authority. But I think that plays into this, that from the Turkish perspective, this was a gamble, if it was. And again, if the idea is that this was going to help the ecumenical patriarchate by saying, look, we now have, depending on how you want to count the numbers, 15, 20 million Orthodox Ukrainians are, affiliated to the patriarchate, and we're no longer, because the Turkish role has always been the patriarchate represents 3,000 or so people in Istanbul. And now you could say, no, we represent millions of Orthodox believers throughout Europe. But now the Turkish government can say that that's great, but we're not, and to show you that we're going to keep closing, we're not going to allow you to open Halki, the theological school. We're going to take these steps on Hagia Sophia to really demonstrate your powerlessness and the fact that your geopolitical allies elsewhere, if you thought the United States was going to weigh in on this, that they're not going to do it, and you've lost that Russia connection, which in years past might have done it. The other thing geopolitically is to watch the very subtle but real shift in the relationship between Russia and Cyprus. The Cypriot Church also recognized the OCU, and we've seen Russia become a lot less interested in defending Cyprus or standing up for Cyprus's territorial and maritime integrity over the last 6 months. To the point that the Russian Navy is now has done exercises in the Turkish claim zone off of Cypriot waters. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with religion? What does that have to do with Christ? What does it have to do with theology? Well, but this is the public institutional side of the matter, which is Cyprus, basically the Cypriot Church essentially signaled that they were going to line up with the ecumenical patriarchate, and now the Russians are signaling that Cyprus is of less importance. And sorry, one last thing, which is also important, is long-term impacts. The long-term impacts of pilgrimage. Hundreds of thousands of Russians who go on pilgrimage every year to Greece, Cyprus, Turkey, to the Holy Land, to Israel, to Palestine. Now that the Russian Church essentially has said some of those areas ecclesiastically are off limits, is that going to be a tool when, if you have parts of Greece or Cyprus that were depending on, thousands of Russian pilgrims coming through, and pilgrims need to eat, they need places to stay, they buy souvenirs, and suddenly that tourist traffic dries up, as we saw with the very successful sanctions Russia applied against Turkey after the shoot down of the Russian jet in 2015, and then suddenly Russian tourists stopped coming to Turkey, and the Turkish economy took a hit, and President Erdogan 6 months later hung that pilot out to dry by saying, well, he acted without orders, and we offer you an apology, and please, we need to see Russian tourists again in Antalya and elsewhere. So are we going to see in the next couple of years, once COVID is done, that you're going to have people in Greece and Cyprus saying, really, we went to the wall for the Ukrainian church, and now my cafe and hotel and pilgrimage hostel is closed because I don't have business coming from Russia, unless, of course, there's a reciprocal amount of Ukrainian pilgrims that would make up for that. So sorry to bring, again, religion down to dollars and cents or euros, but that's going to be very interesting to observe. Already, I think, on Mount Athos, there's concern about how this is impacting Russian oligarch donations to the monasteries of Mount Athos, because a number of the Greek monasteries are suddenly discovering that checks are not being written by Russian oligarchs to support their activities.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. I'm mindful of time, and I think we're out, but I'm still going to ask this. I'll raise this one question that's in the Q&A from Ahmed Raza, very direct and clearly stated. He says, after listening to the entire session by all learned speakers, it is convenient to conclude that the Ukraine crisis is nothing but the power struggle between the West and Russia for their strategic interests in the region, in which religion is the most exploited element. I seek comments from Dr. Igor Zevelev. Igor, your microphone is muted.
You can certainly look from this perspective at Ukraine, and you would be right, but there are some other perspective too, and this is about internal developments in Ukraine. And somebody said earlier about lack of social cohesion and social in a very broad sense. And that definitely contributed to the troubles in this country. But of course, the outside forces significantly amplified that. So there is an interaction between domestic and international factors. So I would not limit analysis to international factors and power struggle on the world arena only. Having said that, I would say that today, as far as I can judge, the Ukrainian society is a little bit more, unified around political national identity, and Russian aggression contributed to that significantly, when often Russian-speaking, Russia-friendly citizens of Ukraine rediscovered their political Ukrainian identity, which was not the main identity probably for them before. But once again, even today, both domestic and international factors are intertwined in Ukraine.
Okay, I really think that we actually needed an entire day to continue the discussion in this panel, but we're out of time, and we'd really like to thank all of our panelists. I think the presentations were excellent, and I think it was a really productive way to conclude a very important conference initiative. So thank you to the organizers and to our panelists, and especially to the attendees for your questions and your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I invite everyone to stay on just for the closing remarks. I want to just thank everyone once more for a really, really tremendous day of discussion covering Religion, Pluralism, and Geopolitics in Ukraine. Before we go to Francois Venn and Chris Pomford, who are going to close things out for us, I want to thank all of the moderator discussants for being with us, taking the time to be here today, the panelists who are all just tremendous, and of course our keynote speaker, Ambassador Herbst, and Professor Henriksen for being with us as well. And run through once more a thank you to every member of the RLD club, Siobhan Heekin-Kennedy, who graduated last year but was part of the brainstorming for this conference, Chris Pomford, Francois Venn, Ben Drolet, Cece Rosenman, and Thomas Crush are our two interns, Gabby Bornstein, also an intern, and then also Lark Escobar, Shireen Shah, Will Crass, and Shelby Sanger for organizing and being the tip of the spear on this conference. And then just finally, just to say one more word about the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. We launched in 2014 when I came to Fletcher, and the main goal of the initiative is to promote religious literacy and integrate religious literacy, the study, knowledge, and skill set associated with religion as part of work on international relations at the Fletcher School, so that those who leave the Fletcher School will be well equipped to be, as I said earlier this morning, innovative, imaginative, and impactful leaders in the world today, and therefore, by that, understanding the role of religion, the real and the perceived role of religion in international affairs today. Our Dean, Rachel Kite, in her welcome this morning, I think, put it beautifully when she also identified the multidimensionality of the way in which religion is relevant to the contemporary geopolitics of Ukraine and more broadly Eurasia. So I want to thank everyone for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to the club leaders. The Student Club on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy is part of the overall initiative, which includes programmatic work, research work, an annual lecture series, and of course, our flagship event, the annual conference. So let me turn it over with no further ado to Chris Pomford and Francois Venn, and thank everyone once again.
Professor. So Chris and I are the co-chairs of the Religion, Law, and Diplomacy Club at Fletcher, and thank you all for being here for this conference. Today we heard from many intriguing and intellectually stimulating remarks from a range of experts. So first of all, to summarize, for the first panel, we heard from Dr. Plohi, Dr. Denishenko, Dr. Shevel, and Dr. Miller, who gave us a riveting discussion on the contested histories, narratives, and identities in Ukraine, as well as the intersection of religion and geography in Eurasia. And then as we went on to the second panel, Dr. Kalenishenko and Dr. Boudreau, as well as Mr. Chapman and Reverend Dr. Bennett, walked us through the religious ecosystem in Ukraine. Ambassador Herbst, with his keynote, offered us a tour de force of the history, the presence, and the role of religion in Ukraine. And we just finished off with the final panel, the third panel, with a wonderful discussion on geopolitics in Eurasia with Dr. Cross, Dr. Gvosdev, Dr. Toft, Dr. Zevelev, and Barbora Maronkova. And finally, for everyone, so everyone knows, the panels and the keynote will be uploaded to the Fletcher Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy YouTube channel to be viewed at your leisure. And of course, thank you to all of our speakers as well. It was a wonderful conference, and we are very grateful you were able to be with us.
We would also like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our sponsors and supporters through this process. This conference was a year in the making, and we could not have done it without the Fletcher Russia and Eurasia program and Tufts Global, alongside our many other partners in the Tufts, the Fletcher, and the Harvard networks. So thank you very much. For any of those who are Fletcher students and are interested in the work and the mission of the Religion, Law, and Diplomacy Club, which seeks to improve and increase literacy in religion and international affairs, feel free to reach out to us on our Facebook, our social media, or via our website, which was just posted by Francois in the chat. We would love to be able to engage with you and continue and see how you can help us continue in the work of the RLD Club and Initiative.
And finally, the conference isn't our only event of the year. We do have upcoming events and programming. On November 13th, Friday, November 13th, Cyril Overon will be speaking, will be coming, and the name of his talk is The Orthodox Church and European Dictatorships in the 20th Century, which should prove to be a very interesting talk, and we hope you can make it for that. And then I'll give it over to Chris for the announcements for next semester.
Yes, and next semester we will have a panel series on religion and peacemaking. And this will be addressing really a core problem that was acknowledged in the conference today, that Western foreign policy is lacking in its understanding and integration of religious topics, history, and actors in its policy considerations. So we're going to talk about religion and peacemaking in 3 or 4 events. We strongly encourage you to come when those are planned. Those details will be released later in the year. That closes off the conference. Thank you so much for attending, and have a good weekend.
Thank you to everyone.